might have to let us know that you give us permission or you stay in the meeting. I'm Erin Schoenberg. I'm with the Center for Rural Affairs, and I'm subbing for Justin Carter this evening. So Justin is who you normally hear from, with this series, which is our Back to the Greenhouse growing series for instructors. I used to work alongside Justin and work on this Greenhouse to Cafeteria project, which I have loved working with different teachers, FFA advisors, and folks like that. So thank you everyone for coming tonight. I get also the opportunity to say I now work with donors for the Center for Rural Affairs. So if you're ever, wanting to explore some options on giving back to our organization, we're a nonprofit, and we'd be happy to use those gifts to further this work. But tonight I'm going to hand it over to John Porter from Nebraska Extension, who will lead us through this evening's session. And then at the end, we're going to save just a couple minutes and I'll send a quick evaluation form in the chat. That way we can just take all of your feedback, positive, negative, everything, give it to us, and just to keep improving these sessions. So John, it is all yours.
Okay, well, thank you very much. So I'm John Porter. I'm the Urban Agriculture Program Coordinator with Nebraska Extension. I'm located in Omaha in the Douglas County and Sarpy County offices here for Nebraska Extension. And I'm also a produce safety trainer with the Produce Safety Alliance, which does a specific type of training for farmers that helps them to follow the law that's called the Food Safety Modernization Act. And I'll briefly touch on that because unless you are growing at least $25,000 worth of produce in your high school greenhouse and selling it to people, you do not fall under the requirements of that law. But it is good to understand some of the things that laws like that cover. So because a lot of them are good, just common sense stuff that you might not think of when it comes to food safety. So I'm going to touch on this evening what we would call good agricultural practices, which is also a term you might have heard. There's actually a voluntary certification program called GAP certification, if you've ever heard of that. Not that also you would have to go through that type of certification for, let's say, if you're wanting to sell produce to the cafeteria. But if you do have students that are doing enterprises and they want to sell to a grocery store, or if you do want to have good food safety information for selling to your greenhouse, to your cafeteria, which is one of the goals of this program, then having an idea of some of these food safety practices would be good to have for your greenhouse. Also, I think it's good training for students. If you're training them in greenhouse production, then giving them an idea of what would be required if they were to get a job producing, let's say, at a greenhouse that's growing fruits and vegetables. It would be good job training for them to understand what might be required versus, we're planting a few things and we're just letting it grow and doing it for fun. To actually go through some of this. And I've done this with one of our local high schools, with Bryan High School. We worked with one of their groups to understand some food safety. And then their goal, and I don't know that they ever got there with the students because COVID, but was to develop a food safety plan that they would use for their greenhouse when they were growing, and also when they were growing outdoor crops. Diane's finally eating lunch, so she's shutting off her video. Enjoy your lunch. So I'm just going to go through some of the things that would be what we would call best practices for produce safety. And I'm going to go through them in terms of, this is if you went through like a GAP certification process. These are the kinds of things that you would look for. Has anyone ever heard of GAP certification or Produce Safety Alliance or FSMA? You can just shake your head if your video's on, or you can type in the chat, or you can hit your reaction button, thumbs up or thumbs down. Any of those terms mean anything to anybody? I got a nope. So there we go. So like I said, none of these things are like required by law, but if you do want to sell your produce to the cafeteria or another entity, these would be good practices to have on hand, and also to understand what are the risks and why produce over the last few decades has become more risky. Why we've seen so many like recalls related to produce items over the last few years. So I'm going to make sure I have the right screen shared, and there we go. So I'm just going to talk about these things in general. Okay, I want to try this one more time. My computer did not like me sharing the screen, so let me try it a different way.
I saw your screen before.
You saw my screen, but my screens went black and I couldn't see anyone or do anything. So, so it's kind of weird. It happened to me the other day. And I just had to send my computer away to be fixed a few weeks ago, and apparently it didn't work.
John, if you end up needing to like send it to me, oh, it looks like you got it, at least on our end.
Okay, we'll see if it stabilizes, because it's going in and out for me. So we shall see. So I'm just going to talk about in general, what are these things that we're looking for? Change this share here. So when we're looking at these good practices for agricultural production, so good agricultural practices, see, it keeps doing it. We're looking at preventing contamination from pathogens, from chemicals, and from physical objects. And so we're looking basically at viruses, bacteria, and parasites, and then from pesticides, fertilizers, sanitizers, and then from like animal and plant debris and dirt. So those are all things that we might want to keep a watch out to make sure that our produce isn't contaminated with those things. And so there are some legislation items that, see, my computer screen keeps flashing on and off and keeps moving around. Am I sounding okay? Like, am I freezing up?
You sound great, John.
Okay.
These slides, this is bizarre. I've never seen anything like it, but it's we're rolling with it. It's working.
Right. I'll just keep moving it around as I try to follow my presentation across the screen. So I mentioned the Food Safety Modernization Act. That is now law that covers produce that farmers grow and sell, anything that is generally consumed raw. It covers farmers that sell in excess of $25,000 of produce a year. Anyone under that is exempt from the rule, but it's a good idea to understand what the practices are. And so there's all kinds of stuff that's in there. If you are interested in learning more about that, because that is a good training, there's a training that we do that goes along with that, where you learn a lot. Like, take what I'm going to talk about today and multiply it by like 8 hours. We have one coming up in Lincoln on November 8th. So if you're interested in that training, it's a certification training, so you would get a certificate to say that you've gone through it. We have an in-person training in Lincoln on November 8th. Just let me know if you're interested, and I'll get you to the details. There are also some remote opportunities to engage virtually with that coming up on a multi-state level, coming up through December through like April. So let me know and I can get you connected to those as well. So we have 8 principles of good ag practices, and a lot of it's around preventing issues. We're going to implement, best practices. The things that we really look at, and I think this is especially important at schools, is human health and hygiene, like things that we learned during COVID, like hand washing, are very important, and water quality, especially for doing hydroponics. But then we have, when we harvest stuff and when we do sort of washing and things like that. So why have we seen an increase in foodborne illnesses related to produce? Number one, we actually are increasing our consumption of produce, and more specifically, we are eating more raw produce versus cooked. If you think back, how many raw fruits and vegetables do you think like your grandparents ate versus what you see people eat today? Fruits, maybe an iceberg lettuce salad, but all kinds of dishes these days have uncooked produce in them. We also are getting our produce from all over the world, and more people are touching it. And so we see that. So individuals consume 20 plus more pounds of fresh produce annually than 20 years ago. And so that's one of the reasons we see an increase in illnesses. And we also see more people, touching our produce. It goes from wherever it's grown to whoever harvests it, whoever moves it. Look, there's a ship of pineapples that's stuck out in the ocean, and you can't get to your grocery store now because of our shipping issues. But then in the grocery store, the person that puts it out, the wildlife that might be in there. We have, whoever is shopping and touching and picking it up until you actually eat it. And then we also have the issue, if you're a farmer or if you're a school, like, would you want to have someone, go on Facebook or on the news and say, hey, my kid ate this food from the high school cafeteria and it was grown in the greenhouse and it gave them food poisoning or what have you. And so we have those things to worry about as well. So we have all kinds of issues that can affect produce. And we have 3 different kinds of contamination that we look at. So for the Food Safety Alliance and the Produce Safety Alliance training, it is mainly the biological issues that we're looking at, foodborne illness, but we do have issues around chemicals and physical contamination that we want to worry about. So the things we want to look at, water safety. So who here goes out or at school, they water their produce and you just spray the water all over the produce, all over the plant. So talk about watering. Who does that with watering? Anyone care to answer?
I haven't had many plants in the greenhouse yet. I've got a couple things broken that are getting fixed right now. But typically that is how we do it. Water all over the entire
Join
plant.
the meeting.
Right, so we typically spray all over. So that's usually okay if the water is coming from like a city water kind of source, like a municipal water source. But if we have well water, or if we have surface water, like from a pond, which a lot of farmers use, then that is considered a food safety risk. And you have to do water testing. You have to show that it has low E. coli levels. And even when you're washing produce, we have to think about water as a way that either introduces or spreads contamination around produce. So you don't think about this, but if you go out and harvest a bunch of lettuce and one of the heads of lettuce has maybe some bird droppings on it, and you put it all in a tub and wash it all together, then you've spread that contamination to everything that was in the tub with that lettuce. And so we have water, we have wild animals. That's a big issue. If a lot of the food safety outbreaks have been because of wild animals, birds flying over. I think there was an outbreak. I can't remember what it was that the outbreak was, but it was caused by feral hogs that went through the fields and left their droppings, and it contaminated this whole field of produce, and there was a big recall. I think it might have been spinach. Another one that we have to think about if we're doing a school garden or if we're doing even home gardening, use of manure and composts. Manure can introduce salmonella and E. coli. And so there's actually, if you're using uncomposted manure or compost that hasn't been heated up to at least 140 degrees for, I think, a minimum of 3 days, then technically there's a recommended waiting period between when you apply that compost or manure and when you can harvest. And that depends on if it's a crop you're growing in the soil, if it makes contact with the soil, like if it's a root crop or a leafy crop that touches the soil, it's 120 days from application to harvest. If it's a crop that doesn't touch the soil, like tomatoes that have been staked up, it's a 90-day recommended waiting period. But then another issue, I think, is personal hygiene and sanitation, and then the post-harvest, handling and washing of things. So we have several different biological food safety hazards, parasites, viruses, and bacteria. The biggest source of those, animals, are one big source, but actually the biggest source in produce we typically see are humans themselves. And we hate thinking about or talking about or saying these things, but it's the fecal oral route where someone goes to the bathroom, they don't wash their hands, then they touch produce, and it introduces E. coli or salmonella or one of the other pathogens that then can make people sick. So soil and water, as I said, are also potential, and especially manure and compost. So that those things might not be an issue if you're growing in a greenhouse and you're using like commercial potting soil. But if you're, say, mixing up your own potting soil and you're including compost or manure, or if you're using an organic fertilizer that might have some sort of animal product in it, like if you're using an organic fertilizer that has like manure in it or blood meal or bone meal, then those are all considered potentially hazardous from an animal source. And so we have all kinds of different things. We have all these outbreaks related to all these different things. So one of the big things that you can do with your students is to make sure that you have a good hand washing policy whenever they are getting ready to handle vegetable crops. Even signage. So for farms, we typically recommend signage telling workers that they have to wash their hands, and amazingly how to wash their hands. So who knows how to wash your hands? Can you walk me through all the steps of washing your hands? Did I have a volunteer? I saw a hand. Or were you just showing us how clean your hands are?
It's been a long time since they put me through that, so.
So it is kind of funny, but whenever we do that food safety training in person and we have farmers in the room, whenever I teach that section, which I teach that often, I actually do a hand washing demonstration and test, which can get some of the older farmers all cantankerous if I make, test their hand washing skills. But we use it's called glow germ. So it's a solution you put on your hands and it glows under black light. And then we send you to wash your hands, and then you come back and see how much of the lotion is still on there. And people always forget that when you're washing your hands, you're supposed to use a paper towel to turn off the water and to open the door. And so that's one of the big steps. So it's washing for at least 20 seconds with soapy water. Doesn't actually have to be hot. This one says hot, but any water with soap. And sanitizer is not considered a viable alternative because it doesn't clean your hands. It just kills some of the germs. Also having a policy, if any of your students or yourself are sick, that then they shouldn't work in the greenhouse because there's more likely to spread germs. And I will tell you, I have a colleague who, from when I was back in West Virginia, this man was a saint. He worked with elementary schools to build high tunnels. So these elementary schools build high tunnels, which are unheated greenhouses. They were growing in ground. And he actually went out to like every one of these schools every week and did something with them in the high tunnel, growing, planting, harvesting, whatever. The year that they started that, he said he has never been sicker in his life because every other week they got some new either gastrointestinal or respiration type virus from all the kids going into the high tunnel, which is a nice, warm and humid and moist environment. And all of these disease pathogens sort of just they were living their best life in this high tunnel. And so it was just spreading all this illness. And he finally started researching and implemented like a hand washing policy, and implemented like, if you're sick, then you don't work in the greenhouse. Maybe you have an alternative task, like you do the record keeping, or you shoot a video, or you take pictures, or what have you, but you don't work with the plants if you're sick. So with manure, it's best if it is thoroughly composted. So that doesn't mean that it's been aged. Aged is just piled up and left sit to compost on its own. Composting means that it's actually turned and it's gotten to at least 140 degrees for at least 3 days, preferably more. If it is thoroughly composted and you can prove that it's thoroughly composted, then you can use it. But there are actually guidelines from the USDA and from other school garden, I guess, experts that if you use compost, it should only be compost that you've purchased and that's certified to have had all the pathogens killed. And if you produce your own compost, like if you have a school garden and you're producing your own, that you maybe only use that on ornamentals because it's really hard to do all the testing and make sure it's safe. And then people say, well, I can always wash the produce, but actually pathogens can be difficult to remove. And I'm going to show you a case where washing certain produce items like tomatoes and melons can actually cause them to take contamination inside of the produce item. And that actually happens when you use very cold water and you go out and you harvest that tomato or that melon and it's warm and you put it in cold water, 10 degrees colder. So that's not a big difference. So if the water is 10 degrees colder than the produce item, then as that produce item cools, it actually pulls water into the produce items through the blossom or the stem end or through any cracks that are in it. Also, don't use any soap or anything like that to wash produce, just plain, cold, potable water. And so they've actually done studies. And so here's a cantaloupe that was at least 10 degrees warmer than the water that it was dropped into. And the water had blue dye in it. And I'm going to show you these pictures and I want to see your reaction. So this cantaloupe actually sucked up this blue water all the way through into the interior because it was put in cold water that was at least 10 degrees colder than it was. And so if there are any pathogens in that water, let's say there was E. coli or salmonella on the outside of this melon or on the melons it was washed with, it just pulled that E. coli and salmonella into this melon with it. So whenever we talk about storage, it really depends on what you're growing. So if you're growing a bunch of stuff and you're trying to store it, there are things that you can store in a cool, dry place and some things that need to be refrigerated. And so we want to think about that. So if you're growing food for the cafeteria, probably you're going to harvest it and take it to the cafeteria and they're going to store it. And hopefully they know how to appropriately store produce items. And probably the biggest source of contamination, again, when you're harvesting, is humans. You're washing produce, you have dirty hands. You want to make sure they're clean. You want to make sure clothes are clean. And at this stage, a lot of farmers, we encourage them to use like aprons and things versus, having someone with their clothes, because you never know, if someone's clothes are clean whenever they're handling produce. You want to have like hair put away. If someone hurts themselves and they have a Band-Aid, you want to cover it with a plastic glove or a rubber glove. You also want to make sure that produce is handled gently. Damaged produce, anytime that it's damaged, that's where some sort of pathogen can enter. And actually, the Food Safety Modernization Act does not permit the selling of dropped produce. And so, like if you have fruit that drops out of the plant and lands on the ground, technically that wouldn't be covered because it could be bruised and damaged. So the option would be like to sell it for cooking, for processing. If you like had tomatoes that fell out of the plant and you just sold them, you wouldn't know if they were going to take it home and they were going to like slice it and put it on a sandwich or turn it into tomato sauce. But if you sold it as a canning tomato, then more or less likely they're going to cook it. The other big question is, should you wash it at all? We actually tell producers that the best way to avoid contamination is by avoiding washing and avoiding using water when possible, because some things, when they get damp or wet, they will mold and it will allow pathogens to grow. And so if it's something that doesn't require washing, just make sure all the dirt is brushed off, that it's sort of shaken or rubbed off, and then refrigerate or store as appropriately. Some things should not be washed before storage, like berries. They will rot in a heartbeat. Things like potatoes, those are also very hard to get dry and then not have them rot when you store them. And then things that you refrigerate should be stored at 40 degrees or less. So refrigerator temperatures, 40 degrees or less. And then you always wash just prior to eating. And so that's a thing that I think maybe we finally trained ourselves that you wash produce before you eat it, no matter where you get it. Hopefully people are doing that. And then, there are shelf lives of different things. A lot of these things we don't have to go through, but some of the harder fruit, apples, can be months if they're stored appropriately in a nice, cool, dry place. Things like melons and peaches and nectarines might be 1 to 3 weeks. When we look at vegetables, those are usually, especially these sort of fresh eating vegetables, usually less than a week. 2 to 5 days is the general range. But then we do have stuff that's longer, that will last for a long time. And then we have some storage crops like potatoes and beets and things that if they're properly harvested and cured, they could actually last for quite a long time if they're properly stored. And then the other question we might have is, well, our cafeteria wants us to, to provide them with a salad mix. And the rule around that is basically you can only sell whole produce under like produce safety rules. Once you cut it up or process it in any way that it's under like food handling rules, and then you have to have all the commercial kitchen and food handlers and appropriate processing and licenses. So even if you were to like chop up leaf lettuce and turn it into a salad mix, that would require all of this. So selling whole produce only would be the key. So you could maybe send the students to the cafeteria and work with the cafeteria staff to chop it up and process it there, but you couldn't do it on your own without either having someone with the food handlers or using that commercial kitchen, which a school cafeteria should be. You just have to have it done appropriately. But then, there's all kinds of rules around good personal hygiene and avoiding cross-contamination and that kind of stuff. But typically, you're only selling whole produce, so you don't have to worry about that. So some resources I thought I would share and talk about. I know we're talking like greenhouse to cafeteria. There are some resources out there, but I know like a lot of the things that you're doing are maybe just more specifically gardening versus greenhouse. Like even if you're growing in containers and greenhouses, you could still look at some garden resources. So Oregon is like a national leader in like farm to school type of stuff. And they have some really good resources around food safety and food documentation that I thought I would share, and I will share a link to this in the chat. If I can get my computer screen to work. So they even have, things like best practices, checklists, like to go through to make sure everything is safe and being safely done. So if you have an outdoor garden or an indoor garden, you could use something like this, like have students do this. If you're harvesting into containers or totes, to make sure they're clean, make sure that, everyone that's in the greenhouse is hand washing and wearing closed-toed shoes or whatever the rules you have are. And then they have other logs and they have other things. And then there is actually from the USDA, there's a food safety tips for school gardens that is also a good resource that covers a lot of different things. In my quick search, I didn't find anything specific to greenhouses, but I'm sure if we look hard enough, we can find it, and I will send them to Justin and Aaron to be sent out. So that's what I have prepared. I know I probably scared, shocked, or bored you, either any of those. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen so I can stop with the weirdness and take any questions or comments.
Yes, don't be shy. We've got the expert in the room. So any question, I know that John can handle.
Well, I'll share the slides. Yes, I will send those to Justin as well, and he can send them out to everyone who registered.
And I am going to, just in case anyone has to, sneak away before the whole hour is up, I'm going to put a link to the really quick evaluation in the chat, which I know helps us a ton. So I'm going to do that.
So
Any
John,
que-
we cut a lot of leaf lettuce
Mhm.
and I usually cut it into just like a sack and haul it over to the cafeteria, and the kids will wash it over in the cafeteria because we cut it and have it come again. We can get, 5 cuttings before we have to ditch the plant.
Yeah, so something like that is fine, like a harvesting cut, like to cut it off the plant is allowed. If you were to like chop that up with multiple leaf lettuces and turn that into like a salad mix, then that would become something that's processed and would require all the food safety, food handlers. But just, cutting it like that is not considered processing.
John, what is the proper way, whether it's a home garden or a commercial venture or an educational venture, what is the proper way to wash or sanitize a melon? You said that they get touched a lot in growing and in transportation, but you don't want that to, if there is any contamination, to enter into the melon, as you demonstrated with the dye. What is the proper way to wash a melon?
Yeah, so you can wash them if you put them in like a tank of water or a sink. You want to make sure that the water is no more than 10 degrees cooler than the melon so that it doesn't uptake water. Probably a preferred method of washing would be like spraying versus dunking into a tank of water, just because then you don't get that uptake issue. And also, a lot of produce washers, it's like a big tank of water and you wash stuff in it. And then you get the contamination that goes from one item to the next item. And so using tank like that, it can spread contamination. There are like sanitizer products that you can use in water like that. We typically don't recommend them for like home growers. But for commercial growers, there are products that you can use. And some of them are even like chlorine based, like bleach. Like we don't recommend like mixing bleach in with your, produce, but there are ways to sanitize produce items. And it's like cleaning and sanitizing that contamination, but it's more about limiting the spread of contamination that's in the water. And so that's what a lot of those products do versus like sanitizing the surface of your produce. And the way that sanitizers work, you actually have to clean the surface first. Most sanitizers will not sanitize a dirty surface. That's why hand sanitizers are not as effective as hand washing because the soap actually removes the dirt and the germs. Sanitizer only kills the germs, but it can be deactivated by the dirt. So if you're doing that at home, like, people use like kitchen cleaners, it's like sanitizes surfaces and you spray it on and wipe it off. That's not how you sanitize a surface. You have to clean the surface and then spray on the sanitizer and then sanitize. And usually the sanitizer has to sit on the surface. And then you let it air dry.
Can I offer another vegetable that I'm a little confused about? And that would be potatoes. When you dig them out of the ground and you spray them on the ground or put them in a bucket to wash, do you still recommend using a sanitizing solution for mass washing in a bucket or a wheelbarrow?
Yeah, you would have to wash and clean those first, but actually, unless there's a need to actually like wash them and totally remove all the dirt, I would not wash them prior to storage because that's one that if they get wet and you don't get them dry, they will rot very easily. So that's one where, typically you harvest and then you would put it somewhere like warm and dark to cure for a few weeks for the skin to set, so that then it doesn't peel off very easily. And then if you need to like brush or sort of rub the soil off for storage, if there's a lot of it, you could do that. And then I wouldn't wash them until you actually use them. I know probably if you buy potatoes at the grocery store, they've been at least lightly washed, but you'll notice that they're not super clean either. And they're in bags, like they're exposed to, you know, they're not in a plastic bag that seals them up. Usually they're in like a net bag where they're still exposed to dirt and stuff like that.
Thank you.
Welcome. I did, when I went back to my search, find one more resource, and this actually does have greenhouse safety resources. This is from Maryland. So I'll put that in the chat as well. It talks about things like aquaponics. And I'll say, I know a lot of schools, you know, that have greenhouses, you're doing hydroponics, and there's like some new emerging rules coming out about hydroponics and aquaponics, because we have that water that then is a good source of contamination. And so there's some emerging work and resources coming out about how do you make sure that that water is safe and not harboring bacteria and viruses that then could get on the plant. So I know some people are using like, you can get relatively inexpensively like a UV sterilizer that the water passes through, and it sterilizes the water. And then it's also just making sure that the produce doesn't come in contact with the water from the system, things like that.
So how's everyone feeling? Are you feeling like more confident? Are you feeling like more scared and more confident at the same time? Like I'm very curious as to how the information is like being received. Does this all make sense?
This is Julie, the phone number from Overton High School. And I think the resources on the aquaponics was kind of more what I was looking for, because that's what we use. And a lot of we are very successful in growing banana peppers. Apologies, my toddler's with me. But I would be very interested in those resources when they come out, because that's something we're going to be utilizing in our new greenhouse very shortly. So thanks for sharing that.
Yes, and so, you know, we have like the banana peppers, you know, using aquaponics increases the risk because you have something that's producing waste that then you're growing the plants in. But having a crop like peppers, where the edible part is like far away from the water, like unless you're like splashing it around really big, then there's a reduced risk because it's not directly touching the water. Whereas there's an increased risk if you're doing something like leaf lettuce or something that actually touches the medium or the water. And so there are things to think about, but just making sure that the water from the system doesn't touch the edible part of the plant. That's the key part.
So John, we've purchased a used greenhouse, and we are getting all of their aquaponics stuff with it. And I don't know, I talked to Stacy Adams. He's not in favor of aquaponics at all. He's much more a hydroponics. But we're getting all this equipment, and we thought we'd try it. Plus there is the idea that you can harvest the fish, harvest the shrimp or whatever you're using in that. And we do have a international program where we have kids on campus 24/7. So not that that would be a great deal, but an occasional meal would be kind of fun. What So if you're growing your lettuce on a raft, does that help to minimize that? And, just you're cutting the lettuce above, on the raft above the,
Yeah, I think, minimizing that contact between, like having that raft, if you think about, if you grow that lettuce out in the garden, like the soil can splash up on it easily when it rains. So if you have that raft, that raft is not going to splash up on it. So as long as you keep, you don't let, a lot of splashing go on, that should be relatively safe in terms of, getting the water on there. And then also making sure, like, if you're inheriting this system, it's probably used. So I would do like a good sanitation on it. Using either purchasing, like finding you can get like specific agricultural sanitizers for produce and for like hydroponic and aquaponic systems, or even like, if you did something like a bleach solution that then you made sure you washed really well or let dry before you introduced anything, because bleach actually vaporizes within a day and is typically gone. Yes, I know that Stacy does not like aquaponics, and it's harder because you have to, basically you balance the plant life and the animal life, and you can't like go full on production with the plants because, usually you can't build up enough of the nutrients in the water to support the plants without like killing the animals from, too much nitrogen in the water.
well, and it's just it's so much more difficult to balance that I don't know that we'll actually try and sustain it. We might just go with an aquaponic system, but we'll see. The other question I had is we just had a little downy mildew on our zucchini that we do have growing in our greenhouse. And one of the solutions somebody suggested was milk. Have you heard of that? Does that raise the path? Is that going to
Right.
contaminate? What's the deal?
I don't know that I would do milk. I've heard of that one. We typically try to tell people to shy away from some of those home remedies because, sometimes they don't work. Sometimes they introduce some sort of issue like that could potentially create a food safety issue. Because it could support the growth of E. coli and salmonella from that milk. So you could, another one that I've heard, you'd have to look up the ratio, but those mildews can be touchy about pH. So if you can change the pH of the leaf surface, so I've heard of like mixing up baking soda in water, and I think there is some research out about that. Like some of these things just have no basis in science and research, like these homemade, like, instead of weed killer, use like Epsom salts and Dawn dishwater. Like there's no research to support that. But I think baking soda is one that is supported by some research.
We did just mix up a solution of different essential oils, and there was research behind it. The gal actually got to present at the National Entomology Conference. But with a spray program of every 4 to 5 days, I think we finally have eliminated the thrips in the African violets we have in the classroom. We have about 100 African violets, and we've been battling thrips for a couple years. And I think after these 3 weeks, we might have them licked.
Yeah, that's difficult. And that's difficult, like, what your own policy is around using like organic pesticides, like, avoid them when at all possible. And then usually if it's an actual pesticide, the teacher needs to apply it versus the students. So it can be difficult to deal with those problems and deal with them in a safe way.
I don't even know if there's a good pesticide that takes care of thrips.
Not really.
Well, I think everyone knows how to get in touch with us. Please speak up if you don't, after this event, if anything else comes up, we'll make sure to get you those slides. John, I know that this is a series of workshops. Just because I'm subbing for Justin, I want to hand it to you as far as, will there be another class?
There
in
are
this
2
series?
more.
Okay.
We're doing a series of 4.
Okay.
And I'm not sure what the 4th one will be because I was in charge of the first 2 and I think Justin's in charge of the second 2. But there will be another one, so we'll look for an announcement. It'll be, I think the November one will be on a different week because there was like a something holiday reminder.
The 4th? Is that what? Ooh,
Yeah.
oh, that's great. November 4th, December 9th. I think I saw it flash by.
Yes. November 4th.
Great.
Yes, because the 11th is Veterans Day. And then December 9th, correct.
Perfect. Well, hopefully see you all then. Thanks again for coming. Last reminder about the eval if you haven't done it. But thanks so much, John. That was really great info. It's always good to keep all of that in mind. It's a very important topic.
Glad to be here.